Welcome to Vigilant News, everybody. This is Justin, and I have a special we're going to be doing today about the continuing series we've been doing on the evolution of the state. We started off at the very rudimentary level of kind of tribes and things like this. We made our way up through the more progressive advanced civilizations like the Roman state, things of this sort. We got a little bit into what a more modern day state would look like. And now we're going to get into a more advanced state. What does a spiritually advanced state look like? And this is all coming from, of course, the Urantia book papers that we've been covering. So I'm going to, as a preamble to all this, I'm going to cover a little bit of the background of the Urantia and address some hangups that we often get almost any time I talk about this subject. And also some interesting things that relate it to modern day Christianity, even the conceptual basis for why we might believe that the Bible is true or the Bible has interesting things to offer, we can actually look to with respect to how the Urantia book can be looked at. So let me just make sure we're still, I'm just going to check to make sure the stream is going. 1 second. All right, the stream is going. So thank you everybody for joining. If you haven't already done so, check the links in the description. We have a promotion going for the next about 7 days or so. Well, till Sunday for sure. We're going to have a special 20% off of everything on EMF Harmonized. So you just go to the description. You're going to find the link right up at the top, 20% off. There's a lot of stuff that we need protection from, like these things here. As a lot of people know, these devices put out a lot of radiation, electromagnetic radiation. Now, it's not ionizing radiation. It's not like the stuff you're going to find in Chernobyl or anything like that. But it definitely isn't healthy for you. And even almost every cell phone manufacturer has in the insert, in the manual, advice to keep the phone at least a ½ inch off of your body, to not make direct physical contact with your body. But, you know, most people have that phone directly making contact with their body. As a matter of fact, Bluetooth, unfortunately, also has a radiation type of effect. And of course, we have Wi-Fi, 5G, all these kind of things. So if you haven't already done so, you can protect yourself to a certain extent, or support your health, I should say. I got to be careful about that, by using some of this technology. And of course, I have to say this for YouTube because we're on YouTube. Any advice or any information I give you is not medical advice. You should always seek the advice of a licensed medical professional anytime you're trying to figure out whether or not something is good or bad for you. Another thing too, don't forget to check the description for vigilant.news. That's the website that is under construction. We're actually starting to build that out to a certain extent behind the scenes. So that will be launched soon, is all I can say. We've got a lot going on. We're also preparing for an event here. We're going to be going to Time to Free America tour in Myrtle Beach, which is going to be one of the bigger stops, apparently. We're going to have a lot of cool people there. We're going to have a media booth. We'll be able to do spot interviews. We'll even try to do some coverage while we're there. So in order to prepare for that, we've got to get a lot of different things. So if you haven't already done so, go to the link in the description, stillnessinthestorm.com/donate, where you can support our work with a one-time donation. Buy us a cup of coffee. You know, if you can spend $5 to buy yourself a cup of coffee, to buy us a cup of coffee. You can even buy us a steak dinner, you know, it's 20, 30, 40, 50 bucks. And of course, you can make larger donations and you can make recurring donations. So all of that is extremely helpful. We got a lot of awesome projects. We've got so much I'm really excited to talk to you about that we'll be discussing here in the future, and your support makes that directly possible. And again, a big shout out to the bigger contributors that we've had over the past few days. Thank you on behalf of all those who can't contribute, especially during these crazy times we're living in. If you haven't already done so, oh wow, there's a hawk in my backyard right now. If you haven't already done so, you know, stock up for sure, because gas prices are probably going to climb significantly here. And this actually is a good, you know, kind of geopolitical situation to discuss the importance of an enlightened society, a truly spiritual society, a truly free society. You know, we're living in a world with globalist machinations, Klaus Schwab and Great Reset shenanigans, people wanting to create their own immortality away from God, people thinking that they can have a free and prosperous society outside of God and outside of spirituality. And the cold hard truth, I'm not going to mince words, guys. I don't think that's true at all. I do not think it's possible for us to have a truly benevolent, free, and prosperous society without God at the front and center stage. Now, let me just say right up front, when I say God, I don't necessarily mean this like dry, bland, empty religious platitude where we get, hyper wealthy priest class that secretly rule over humanity from behind the scenes while us plebs just sit back and hope we get a few scraps. That is not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about the true substance of what a godly or a spiritual society or an enlightened society is. And that is one where the freedoms of the individual are regarded as sacred and your rights are endowed by the creator. So you've got everything you have, your mind, your body, your soul, it came from somewhere. And I would argue the best explanation, and this is not only true at a personal level for me as somebody who studies these things, this is true at a jurisprudence or a philosophy of law level. To date, throughout all of human history, even if, let's just assume for the moment we're dealing with the mainstream history of about the past 10,000 years or so, nobody's been able to come up with any better explanation for the fact that what makes the society what it is, it has to have some type of spiritual backdrop or spiritual connection. Rights, we don't know where rights come from if you separate God from the situation. But as soon as you put a creator being, a supreme being, a divine being, where all reality seems to emerge from, then rights seem to make perfect sense because we are children of that divine. We also, even within atheistic science, we have this idea of a Big Bang, and they've invented, multiple universes. Interestingly enough, that idea of the multiverse, which is so popular now, actually comes from, at some level anyway, their attempt to try to explain where life came from. Because, and this is some of the work I'll be drawing a little bit from Stephen C. Meyer, who does, he wrote the book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, and a couple other books. They escape my mind right now, but essentially he is a theist, a modern day scientific theist that is arguing to date the best explanation we have to explain all of physics and reality is still a theistic explanation. And what tends to happen in atheistic science is they have to invent all sorts of things because their explanations don't make sense. And that is true to this day, although you won't hear about what I just said on the Science Channel or Discovery Channel or even PBS. So, when we talk about, anytime we talk about religion or science or spirituality or the state or things like this, it can be easily pigeonholed into, well, you're talking about a religion. I'm talking about Christianity. I'm talking about Islam. I'm talking about Buddha, these kind of things. I want to make a difference in the sense that those religions draw from the same spiritual substance, the same information that a society uses to build on itself. But it's not like, the Catholic Church just like handed down the hand manual for how to create a society to the founding fathers of the United States. And then that's what they used. As a matter of fact, they did a lot of what I have been doing and a lot of other people have been doing in the modern age, which is getting down to the core substance. What is the actual meat and potatoes, to use that analogy, of what a religion or a belief in a theistic God or creator looks like? Because there's a difference between the old man in the sky who's holding that like weird, globe with a cross on it, and it's, judging us for all the things we're doing bad, and the actual substance. Like, what do you actually deal with at a personal level? Well, interestingly enough, when we think about your experience of the divine, which is all this, I'm going to lead up to our discussion today. So thank you for bearing with me. And by the way, if you have any questions, I always love taking questions, especially about this subject. It's one of the subjects I absolutely love talking about. So feel free to pop that question in the YouTube. I will be checking that pretty regularly here. And pop your questions in there. So, what the founding fathers essentially did, they were theists. They wanted to get to the substance of something. And one of the interesting things about your personal relationship, the true concept, or one of the best descriptions of what a personal religion is it's not that you're, a Christian. It's not that you're an Islam. It's not that you're a Muslim. It's that you have a relationship with reality. So you might say your most primal and most all-encompassing relationship is your relationship with reality itself. What do you experience when you drink your coffee in the morning? What do you actually feel in your body? What are the sensations? What are the thoughts that come to mind? That is your direct experience with reality itself. And that is the true substance of what I would call a religious personal experience. So your relationship with reality is itself a divine relationship. What I mean by that is if we take the word divine and we apply the meaning, which is congruent with almost every use of the word throughout religion, although you don't necessarily hear this too much overtly spoken in a lot of religious services, is the concept of the word divine is defined as the total and all-inclusiveness of all reality. So everything that exists in reality, not only, the things you're looking at right now, your computer screen, your phone, whatever, however it is that you're watching me, not only the music you might listen to, not only the stars you look at, but literally everything, every single thing that you could possibly imagine and all the infinite things you can't imagine and how all those things are related, that's what the word divine signifies. And what's interesting is that we don't know where personality comes from. And I study a lot of psychology. In the atheistic psychology, they like to say, oh, well, personality is just like a bunch of neurons firing in your brain, and that's where personality comes from. Not really. There's a lot of holes in that. For a long time, we thought that personality was just a blank slate, that everybody was just a blank slate. And the reason you developed the personality is because you just so happened to encounter various things since you were born. And then that, like a snowball, it slowly accumulated. And then eventually, poof, there was your personality with all the various proclivities and interests and desires and excitements and joys and fears and all that just kind of emerged as a result of your random interaction with reality. Well, we now know that that's probably definitely not the case. We now know that almost every experience that you experience, and this is true at a neurological level, so the hardware of your biology in the brain and in your central nervous system, but also just phenomenologically and ontologically. So in other words, what do you actually experience? When I take a sip of my coffee, what do I experience? What am I actually feeling? Well, all of that stimuli in the coffee enters the hardware of our brain, and all of that pre-programmed hardware generates this experience we have. So what actually is the case, and this is something that, interestingly enough, the AI researchers are starting to encounter, is that every single thing that you experience, at least to a certain extent, is an aspect of pre-programmed reality. So in other words, that your personal experience with reality, your personal experience in life itself, the best explanation we have to work with, and this is my personal assertion, but I'm not the only one asserting this, and essentially, the scientific community is asserting this in substance, but they don't use these words because they don't like to talk about theistic explanations. The best experience, or the best explanation, is that almost everything that you are experiencing right now is pre-programmed. So think about it like a video game. Everything that a character does in a video game was designed by the programmer. If you have the ability to jump in the game, it's because the programmer gave you the ability to jump. If you have the ability to swing a sword or, change some aspect of your character, depending on what kind of game you're playing, it was programmed into the game itself. Well, you as a being are exactly like that. Now, that doesn't mean that literally everything you experience is some kind of draconian pre-programmed thing and it's all a roll of the dice and you have no choice at all. No. That's not the case at all either. It's very similar to a video game. So in a video game, you can, especially these, what are they called? Sandbox games, where you can kind of roam around in this big giant area. Well, everything was created in that area, but they didn't necessarily know where exactly you were going to step. What they did is they created various pre-programmed events that would happen depending on what you've done. And so it's a synthesis. So as you play the game, you start to trigger things, and then what gets triggered creates different possibilities for what you experience as the game progresses. Reality is the same way, especially as we evolve as creatures. If you're, for example, if you're immersed in a culture that speaks Chinese, then as the human mind evolves, that pre-programmed aspect of linguistics, which is often, I think it's like right here, just before the tip of the neocortex, things like this, you're going to end up learning Chinese. So all of this is to say that there's an aspect, there's a kind of divine guidance. It's like God knew what was going to happen. So if we take that concept of God created universe, then is it that God didn't expect us to create civilization? No, I would say, just like any game designer, if you're going to design a game, you're going to think about every possible way, a million different ways that things could go. And you're going to want to create a situation that accounts for each of that, because you got an agenda as a game designer. You're not creating the game just for no reason at all. And you're just putting a bunch of random crap in there and you're like, oh, we'll see what happens. No, you want the player of the game to do things and get from one place to another, to get from the beginning to an end or the end. And I would say the creator did the same thing. Everything that we experience to a certain extent is one of the options, and our free will choice, every time we make a choice, then that synthesizes with the creator's buffet of choices. So very similar to, if you were going to go and walk outside of your house right now and go take a walk, there's all these different places you could go. The creator didn't force you to go down one place. He gave you all these options. And then when you choose one of the options, then that crystallizes or catalyzes or manifests one of the various choices. And then that itself becomes something that influences future choices, right? If you spend 20 years eating nothing but McDonald's, then you're making a set of choices that is going to limit the scope of possibilities you have in the future to ones that, probably aren't so healthy for you. So it's exactly the same thing with society. There's a course, there's a path of evolution. Society evolves down a course. We're going from one place to another. And ultimately, and this is what the really cool thing about all this is, the founding fathers seem to have grasped this to a certain extent. They were skeptical of entrenched religions. Think about it, in the past. We had King George. Oh, sorry about that, everybody. One second. My phone. There we go. I'll just close that tab. It'll just keep ringing if I don't take that off. All right, sorry about that. They were skeptical. Whoa. There we go. Okay. So where was I? So the founding fathers, they were skeptical of religions. This is coming from an age in the 16th and 17th century, the whole religious control aspect of humanity, which, we aren't getting conspiratorial. Mainstream academics acknowledge the fact that for most of history, religion was not necessarily used to enlighten people. That wasn't the primary objective. The primary objective was to be one aspect of societal control, to give the priest class or the king a way to control the population. And so this is just well acknowledged throughout history. In the 16th and 17th century, when the founding fathers really coming on, especially the 18th century, when the Enlightenment was really starting to explode, the idea that people could develop a more personal relationship with divine and not necessarily be pigeonholed into one religion was really starting to take off, and it had a whole aspect to it. That's where a lot of these, secret societies really started to be developed. The Rosicrucians, the Hellfire Club, even the Sabbateans and the Frankists, all those types, even the Bavarian Illuminati, this was all founded on this idea that brotherhood, that you developing a personal connection with the reality experience you apart. Remember the thing that I defined earlier of the personal religion relationship with your relationship with reality, that was starting to explode and emerge, which means that the founding fathers wanted to acknowledge that there was a much more real connection to God than what you experience at church. Now, does that mean that what you experience at church is, totally bogus? No, it doesn't. What it means is that, there's things that happen there and they're good, and, not everything is good, obviously, but there's a lot of good that happens there. So I'm not vilifying churches or religions. What I'm saying is that there's a difference between the social aspect and what happens at a personal level. Everybody and their grandmother decides to call me while I'm doing a live stream. So let's get into this. We have the evolution of the state. We have the evolution of consciousness of the individual. And then as the individual evolves in consciousness, then they start to work with other people. They form tribes, they form, fledgling nations. Those fledgling nations then unite together in some capacity, fledgling tribes unite in some capacity to form a nation. And then those nations start to work together. And then eventually you get a situation where you have what would effectively be called a global government, although it's a lot different than the craziness that is coming through the World Economic Forum. The so-called kingdom of God that we hear so much about in Christianity, that is essentially a one world government, except instead of the, Klaus Schwab and George Soros and any of these other maniacs deciding, Bill Gates, any of these maniacs deciding what kind of life we should lead and what values we should have and all this, right? It's actually God. It's actually the divine. That's what leads and unites the free people. And then, interestingly enough, and this is what we're going to get into today, what you have is you don't have the destruction of personal sovereignty. So, when we think of one world government, we think of, oh, well, there's no United States anymore. Now we're just one of these these vassal states for the global government that's in Switzerland or something like that. That's not what a truly divine government is, according to the Urantia book and according to what I would say. And this is also echoed in Urantia, by the way, but in other what I would deem to be more on point, accurate predictions about how far things could go in a positive way. It's also depicted in Star Trek, although Star Trek, systematically severed that divine connection. So you're not going to hear about any kind of spiritual things discussed too much in a Star Trek type society, but it's basically the same type of a thing. We are going to, as time goes on, a society progressively becomes more altruistic and they want to start working with each other. And eventually we get to the point where we stop fighting each other over petty things and we actually start forming a human family. But that doesn't mean we all live in the same house. It's not communism. We still have nations. We still have territories. We still have tribes. We still have communities and families. They're just all integrated now. So all that being said, let's get into the discussion. Oh, thank you. I'm looking at the chat right now. It looks like we got some people talking about how anticipated they are for this discussion. That's good. Yeah, I love this series. I at some point, if I have time, I'll do a lot more stuff about this because it's stuff that's very fascinating to me. And I think it's important. We need to know this stuff. If there is a spiritual manual for how we as people should live our lives and try to work to form a more perfect union, then should we understand that? Should we be talking about it? I think we should be. So let me address the elephant in the living room. Anytime I start talking about the Urantia book, on the one hand, you got atheists who are like, that's just a bunch of ufology nonsense. Who cares who don't even knows if it's real? And then on the other end of the spectrum, we got the Bible thumpers that are like, oh, well, it's not in the Bible. It's got to be of Satan and the devil. Well, interestingly enough, this is the punchline I would say to all that. If it has information in it, if it has true information in it, doesn't matter what the package is, what the name is, who wrote it, where it comes from, who's been reading it, who thinks it's popular, any of that stuff. What's important is that it has true information and we can learn something from it. Can you learn from an untrue story? Can you learn from a fictional story? Absolutely. You certainly can. If you watched a fictional video right now of somebody burning their hand on the stove because they grabbed a hot pan without an oven mitt, could you learn from that experience and avoid the peril of grabbing that item on the stove? Absolutely. So, the discussion of whether or not the Urantia book is absolutely true as it's presented is a discussion for another time. The question is, does it have something to teach us? Can we contemplate it? Can we use it as an exercise to chew with our, mental teeth, so to speak, and masticate that information to distill from that true wisdom? I would argue yes. I mean, I wouldn't be talking to you about it if I didn't think it has some value. But yes, I would argue yes. And the same is true for the Bible or any religion for that matter. If the flying spaghetti monster religion had a piece of amazing information in it, I don't necessarily think the universe was created by a flying spaghetti monster, but if it had a piece of wisdom in it, I would absolutely give it credence and I would enfold it and incorporate it into my personal life view and my philosophy. So now here's another interesting point. We often hear that the Bible was inspired, right? That it was written by men, but they were inspired by angels or God directly. Theophany is when it comes directly from God, and prophecy is when it comes from some, other entity, or mysticism is when the individual uses their own mind, goes through some magical process and gets a glimpse of heaven and then brings those secrets down to earth. That's what mysticism is. That's what a lot of the Kabbalah is actually, in Jewish mysticism. So, we hear about all that, and that's why we know for sure that I'm kind of speaking for the Bible thumpers out there. We know for sure that the Bible is 100% absolutely true because it was inspired. Well, inspired is essentially saying that a person received a message from somewhere else. In the modern age, in the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th century, we called that mediumship. So when a medium would make contact with the spiritual force and received a message, we would call that a medium. Or in the modern age, we call that being psychic. Or even later, although maybe this term has always been around, but I heard about it in the 2010s and 12s and things like this, a channeled message. In the New Age crowd, we call them channeled messages. So essentially, in substance, when you ask the question, where does the Bible come from? You could accurately state it's a channeled work. It's a medium work. It's a little different. And frankly, we don't really know whether or not the stuff that was written in the Bible actually came from the people. I think that the Bible is one of the most heavily manipulated works of humankind, because do you think that the people who orchestrated the Roman Empire, who are some of the most malevolent, destructive people on the planet, who took the necropolis that was in Egypt and moved it to the Vatican, I believe it was around the 11th century, the same people who would openly torture women and children in an effort to do all sorts of things, do you think they just were like, oh, well, there's this divine work, there's these writings, these books that are coming out from people like Luke and Matthew and John. Do you think they didn't want to somehow manipulate that and twist and distort that for their own ends and purposes? Of course. I mean, that's like believing the same people who told you that 2 weeks to slow the spread, that the vaccines are safe and whatnot. They might have misrepresented the truth, as we now know. But we can totally believe the official narrative with respect to Ukraine. I mean, come on, you don't have to be a rocket scientist here. So I'm not saying it's untrue. I'm just saying there's reasons to think that it might have been slightly manipulated. But despite that, the Bible is still loaded with amazing information. So again, it doesn't really matter whether or not the Bible's true. The question is, does it have something to teach you? And we're going to use that same thought process and logic with respect to the Urantia book. Interestingly enough, the Urantia book alleges to be effectively channeled by a group of mediums who are trying to make contact. At least this is the story. The story is in the 1910s and 20s, a group of mediums were trying to make contact with angels and various divine beings. Because remember that back at that time, mediumship was all the rage, right? People were getting together in dark basements, sitting around crystal balls, doing all sorts of crazy stuff because they were trying to make contact with other realities and spiritual beings. And allegedly they did. The one story, one story I've heard is that each paper came through as a piece and it was slowly assembled across time. Another story I've heard is that one of the mediums in the spiritual group went to bed one night, they woke up and the whole manuscript, the over 2,200 pages of 196 papers just materialized and was bang, ready to go. Who knows? I don't know. Again, doesn't really matter where it came from for our purposes in the discussion. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on the message, and we'll discuss the messenger and how credible they are another time. Exactly. Just read the book yourself. I have heard of the Divine Council by Dr. Helser. His work is quite interesting. Okay, so let's get into this here. So I'm going to actually, let's see. See if I can do this. I think, yeah, that's how I would do it. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to pull up the paper of discussion today. And that paper is, wait, this isn't the right screen. I'm going to go to that, just looking at my pretty face. This is the paper. Okay, here we go. Hopefully this will work now. There it is. All right. So one of the cool things about the Urantia book, just like the Bible, is it's free. You can literally read the whole thing for free online. You don't have to pay a dime. I happen to like real books, so I often, buy the books I want to read. But you can even listen to the book. You can listen to the whole thing, audiobook. I don't know when that was recorded, but that's the audiobook that's been kicking around. Even Amazon has that version. So again, there's a lot. I will refer, if you're wondering, because this is part 4, well, where's the other parts? I haven't compiled them yet. Maybe I'll get a chance, hopefully at some point, to put them all in one place, the parts to this discussion. But if you want to know where it is, go to the Rumble channel. It's in the description. Go to Rumble, look at the mega streams, and you'll see I often put in the title of the mega stream, spiritual discussion, and you can, find them there. But all of the parts that I have in here are in the mega streams. You just got to go back, do a little bit of work, and you can find them. So we're going to skip down. I'm not going to review everything because we'd be here for 3 hours. And, when we're getting into this, yes, this is the one we discussed previously. So I'm actually going to start by reading these 12 points. I'm not going to go super deep into them because I discussed this the last time. And we're going to jump into the more advanced sections of this. Now, there's another paper, I believe it's paper 53 or 54, like the evolution of a world, something like that. It talks about the 7 spiritual phases of evolution from the perspective of these beings. Now, you might be wondering, like, well, where the hell did this come from, Justin? Well, where the heaven it came from is heaven, supposedly, like actual angels, divine beings, beings that brought the life plasm to our world when our world was seeded with life several billion years ago, according to this story. Those beings literally wrote it. As a matter of fact, the being who wrote this paper was a Melchizedek. So a Melchizedek is one of the beings. You ever heard that term before, Melchizedek? Yeah, it's supposedly the divine being that I believe helped counsel Salem and helped pave the way for the incarnation of Jesus some 600 years before Jesus actually walked the earth 2,000 years ago. So, whether or not that's true or not, I'm not sure, but it's the claim, if we were just to look at the claim, right? Like, let's evaluate what the supposed alleged story is. The alleged story is that literally a being from heaven brought this information to humanity. It was a revelation. It's actually, in the Urantia community, it's described as the 5th epical revelation of God to man. All right, so I'm going to just read this little brief section here. Economics, society, and government must evolve if they are to remain. Static conditions on an evolutionary world are indicative of decay. So in other words, if things aren't progressing, then there's decay. Now, that doesn't mean, I know this word progressive has kind of become like a dirty word, right? We're not talking about liberal progressive insanity where there's no genders and, all that crap. What I'm talking about is progressive as in things are actually getting better. And that's one of the most important aspects to a truly spiritual society and what defines real spirituality. What is real spirituality? Well, it's not just like mindlessly reading a bunch of passages that don't make any sense to you and they put you in this like happy, blissful state. Although that's certainly how it's valued, to be sure. We need to rejuvenate ourselves. But true spiritual progress, or let me rephrase, practical spiritual progress, like what does it actually do to your life when you become more spiritual? It makes things better. I just watched a documentary last night on Rise TV. It's called Finding Courage, and it discusses it's a riveting story. If you got a dry eye watching this movie, good for you, because I was not having a dry eye throughout the story, we'll put it that way. And it talks about the benefits of Falun Gong. And one of the benefits of Falun Gong, seemingly across the board, is that it makes people's lives better. It tends to remove depression, anger, frustration, heals diseases. It makes people more resilient to all sorts of things. Some of the people the Chinese have been torturing people for a long time, 60 years or so. I'd say that's a pretty long time. But the Falun Gong people that they've been torturing since 2001, I believe, they're some of the most resilient. They'll endure ridiculous amounts of torture, like having their backs broken, having all sorts of horrific shit I won't get into here. But so spirituality makes things better. And I believe it's Matthew, forgive me, I think it's Matthew 5, 6, 8 or something like that, or 7, 8. Be you perfect, even as the Father in heaven is perfect. But essentially the game, if we were to think about spiritual growth as a game, the ultimate game of existence is the quest for perfection. And what that essentially means is you're trying to make things in your life better. So if you're trying to make something in your life better, whether it's cooking a better meal for your family or yourself, whether it's being more efficient in your morning and getting up process, what doesn't matter what it is, or being more loving and kind to your friends and family, trying to better serve humanity, some of the more things that we tend to associate with spiritual growth. That is spiritual growth. You are actually part of the very elite club of spiritual warriors or spiritual people who are trying to actually make things better. What is not necessarily spiritual is just mindlessly maintaining dogma that never grows beyond the original inception. Okay. All right. So I've already gone on quite the rant here. Let me try to par it down a little bit. So let me just read through these things, or I'll finish the statement. Only those institutions which moved forward with evolutionary stream persist. The progressive program of expanding civilization embraces, so these are some of the attributes of an expanding civilization: the preservation of individual liberties, right? The protecting people's rights, protection of the home. So that has to deal with property, and the concept of a home itself, that the home, the family, is the social cell of the body of civilization. Promotion of economic security. So an economy, you're like, well, what is an economy anyway? That term's flown around so much. The economy is basically the thing that a civilization uses to enable the individual to prosper. And then through that individual's prosperity, the society improves, right? So if you have all the wealth and resources you need and you're a creative person, well, now you can invent better things that make society better. That's what an economy is supposed to be. And that's what, and it also facilitates the acquisition of resources and the fair distribution of resources. And that's why it often involves a financial system, because the financial system is supposed to, it's supposed to be a lawful point system that measures the contributions of individuals and assesses those contributions a certain value, whether we're talking dollars or bank credits or whatever, that then individuals can use to exchange goods and services with each other. The prevention of disease. So where society should take care of itself. When you think about a society, another good analogy, think about the human body. Do you want to engage in practices that prevent disease? Almost everybody does, even the people who are just wholesale believers of the mainstream medical system Kool-Aid. If you're trying to take a vaccine because you think it's going to prevent COVID, then you want to prevent disease, which means you want to keep your body healthy. Well, a society should be doing the same basic thing. Compulsory education. This is something that, when you hear compulsory, you're like, oh my God, like they're going to force people to get educated. Well, yes and no. What it's basically saying is that and this is something that we should just acknowledge, I would argue, that in today's world, imagine if you had all the education you needed to be an expert in whatever field you needed to walk into, would that be beneficial for you? Do you think you could lead a positive life and a good life and have economic prosperity and not be a burden to the people around you if you were better educated? Of course. And that's true at many different levels. As a matter of fact, in progressive civilizations, at least this is what's described in the Urantia book, as a civilization evolves, it starts to create a weighted voting system, or at least some of them do. And what that means is basically that, if we're an analogy I love to use, you might have heard me say before, if you're trying to hold a vote for what bridge should get built in your town, should the person who has no knowledge about bridges whatsoever, should their vote have the same weight as the expert engineer who's reviewed all of the information? Should somebody who's not spent 3 seconds of time studying a subject, should their vote count merely because they like what that guy's wearing as a suit and they don't like what that other guy's wearing? Should that person's vote matter as much as the person who's taken the time to carefully evaluate all the proposals and really has an expert in what the decision would mean for the people? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, really, right? If you're going to go to a restaurant with somebody and they're like, you should go to this restaurant. And they're like, and one person's like, well, I've been there and the food sucks and it made me sick. And the other person who suggested it is like, oh, I've never been there, but I hear it's good. Should their vote count as much as the guy who actually went there and got sick? A compulsory employment. A civilization, just like a house, if you're living in a house, or a better example, I would argue, is a ship or a military situation, a platoon. There's a certain level of minimum work contribution that's necessary. And if you don't contribute that, then the whole quality of life and the mission is going to be potentially jeopardized. Have you ever lived with a roommate who refuses to clean the dishes and refuses to clean the room and is constantly leaving the stuff in the toilet and all that kind of stuff? Well, don't you want some minimum level of necessary contribution to maintain your quality of life because you're living with them? Well, extend that concept to the whole civilization. Should there be compulsory employment? Well, I think there should be. Now, does that mean that we should force people who are like infirmed or indigent or incompetent to work in positions they're not qualified for? Should we force somebody to bear a burden they can't bear? Well, no, of course not. We don't want to, create a totalitarian state. It's not like forced labor camps. What it is that, hey, the reality is there's no such thing as a free lunch. I know there's a lot of people out there that are like, yeah, universal basic income, woo, we're just going to be able to sit at home and do nothing and receive all these benefits from society. That is a pipe dream that the globalists want you to believe so that you can so that you can embrace the Great Reset agenda, which includes a universal basic income, by the way. one of the reasons you're going to own nothing and love it is because they're going to own everything, and you'll be forced to do things to get your universal basic income. You better believe it. Don't just think they're just going to hand you the keys to paradise free of charge. So profit utilization in leisure. This is a profitable utilization of leisure. So this is something that's really awesome. As a society progresses, the amount of time it takes to maintain that society diminishes. And in later phases, which again, I believe was paper 52, something like that in the Urantia book, they describe that a society, I'll just say the later ages of society, it takes as little as an hour a day. So imagine if you could have in a single hour, you could not only clean your house and cook all your food and go to do all the work you need to do to contribute to society. You could do all of that in an hour's time, and then the rest of the day was for literally using your leisure time to enhance your knowledge, to enhance your social connections, to enhance your understanding and your relationship with the divine itself, and as a result, become an even better contributor to society. That's where we're headed. Care of the unfortunate speaks for itself. Race improvement. This is a really controversial one. I'll just say, and this is one that I often hear about when we start talking about the Urantia book, because the Urantia book says some pretty sensational claims that we should be more intelligent with how we reproduce. Now, does that mean that we should be not sanitizing, sterilizing, that we should be sterilizing people that we think have less than ideal genes? No, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, it's not necessarily about preventing people from reproducing. It's about giving people better understanding about how their choices with reproduction affect the future generations. So if you had 10 different potential mates that you could look at, and you could look at how each of those mates and what would be the resulting genetic health of your mate choice, would you want to know that? Would you want to know that, there is actually a consequence, and right now we kind of just have the blinders on. We're like, oh, no. But what I choose to do with my mating choice has no effect on my children. Well, that's not true. We definitely know that in our current society. But we haven't really fully embraced the fullness of that truth because we still got a little PTSD from all the crap that happened in the first part of the 20th century with these eugenics programs and stuff. The cabal absolutely believe in race improvement. And that's one of the reasons why they're pushing what Mark Passio calls epi-eugenics, or epi-dysgenics, as he calls it. So in other words, it's the idea that instead of forcing people to be sterilized, which is what they tried, with Margaret Sanger, the person who founded Planned Parenthood, who thought all Black people were degenerates, by the way. That's an interesting thing. You wouldn't hear that quote coming from any leftist media. They participate in race. The cabal participates in race improvement. I'm sorry, I lost myself for a second there. The epi-dysgenics is we're going to affect your value choices through porn, through dating apps, through mainstream media, through Disney, so that you unconsciously make a choice that reduces the genetic inheritance of your forebear, of your children, of your offspring, of your posterity. And so that across time, the end goal, and I think this is true, this is my personal opinion, the end goal is to create a hyper intelligent, fit, advanced, long-living elite society. One of those things is transhumanism, by the way, so that they create supermen, think Elysium, and then us plebs down at the bottom, we just we're so lucky we got some scraps from the gods on high who have ascended, and we're just plebs down at the bottom. So that's what they want to do. So again, this is a controversial thing, but the truth is that there is actually a consequence to who you decide to have children with. And if we are willing to, at some future point in time, embrace this truth more fully, we'll be able to have healthier children and a healthier race in general. I'll just leave it at that. But let me just say for the record, I am not about eugenics. I am not about forced sterilization. I am about freedom responsibly given. Promotion of science and art, pretty self-explanatory. Promotion of philosophy and wisdom. This is huge. I could talk about this one for 2 hours, no joke. But essentially, where does true knowledge come from? It comes from philosophy. If I showed you, I'll use an analogy I use all the time. We'll get it over with quick. If I asked you to look outside because it's raining, and then you go and look outside and it's not raining, it's actually sunny, then what happened is you've used philosophy to go and gather data, just like a scientist. You went outside and you observed, and you're like, well, it's actually sunny outside, Justin. It's not raining. And because I have in my mind recorded the claim that you said it was raining and it's not raining, it's actually sunny, I can compare the two and distill a meaning from that exercise that says your claim that it's actually raining outside when it's not is false. That is a philosophic exercise. When you do that properly, you develop wisdom. So when you use your mind to distill true knowledge and you act on that true knowledge to affect the world in the way you intended, then that's wisdom. And that is extremely important. Well, really simply, technology. Technology is philosophy and wisdom embodied. When you pick up a device and it works properly, it's because somebody spent time and energy to develop true knowledge and then applied that true knowledge to create a device that actually works. So that, as you can imagine, as a society advances, we need more and more true knowledge and wisdom. Excuse me. Augmentation of cosmic insight, spirituality. So in other words, well, it's another massive one, but in other words, the more we advance as a society, the more values we discover. Like, 10,000 years ago, we didn't really care too much about tolerance with respect to other tribes. It was all about you fighting with whatever tribe was trying to encroach on your territory so that you could have the resources you needed. But now we've discovered the importance of tolerance and unity and peace and things like this because we value these things. So there are objectively beneficial values. There are things we should value that come from heaven, I would argue. They're in heaven waiting for us, and then we discover them through our philosophy and through our spiritual insight. And then we're like, hey, you know what? This whole golden rule thing, this whole forgiving our enemies and loving everybody and, turning the other cheek, it's actually got some utility to it. Maybe we should embrace it as a society, things like this. So, all right, I'm going to check the chat real quick and also check the time to see where we're at. And then we'll continue with the discussion. Excellent. All right. Well, glad you all are enjoying it. Feel free to ask a question. I haven't, Julian, I haven't dived too much into Dr. Heiser's work with the Divine Council. I know he's done something about it. It's the last time I looked at it, I only briefly looked at like one video. He's got massive amounts of information. I think it was in 2015. So it's very interesting. He has new perspectives on how some of the things that we've heard about in the Bible and stuff like that is translated. And I would say it's all very good food for thought for sure. All right, feel free to pop in any other questions y'all might have. I'm going to keep going with this. So let's see here. Why does it do that? Hold on. Sorry about that, everybody. Maybe it's not doing what I'm thinking it's doing. It's hard to tell from my perspective. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to just quickly read through this, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of what we want to discuss today. And this progress in the arts of civilization leads directly to the realization of the highest human and divine goals of mortal endeavor. Mortals are us, people. The social achievement of the brotherhood of man and the personal status of God consciousness, which becomes revealed in the supreme desire of every individual to do the will of the Father in heaven. So in other words, the brotherhood of man, that's the goal. If we're all truly children of the divine, then when we start to when the reality of the divine becomes more entrenched in our society, which, there are forces waging war on the concept of the divine, the atheists. What is the religion of China? It's atheism. What is the religion of totalitarianism? It ends up being atheism in one form or another. The appearance of brotherhood signifies that a social order has arrived in which all men delight in bearing one. They actually desire to practice the golden rule, to do unto others as they would have them do unto each other. But such an ideal society cannot be realized when either the weak or wicked lie in wait to take unfair and unholy advantage of those who are chiefly actuated by devotion of the service of truth, beauty, and goodness. It's a lot to chew on there. So basically what's getting at here is, the weakest link effect. If we got people who refuse to work or are incapable of work, but we're putting them in positions where they have to maintain a really important aspect of society. Hey, can you think of any politicians that might not be qualified, either because they don't know what they're doing, they're weak people, weak. That's what that word means there. Or they're wicked. They're claimed to be really all for about supporting this or that cause, but behind the scenes, they're actually pushing globalism. They're working with China. Can you think of any politicians like that? I can think of a few. That's what that statement is getting at. We have to deal with those people. We have to take those people out. Doesn't mean we're killing them. Doesn't mean we're throwing them in prison forever. Doesn't mean we're torturing them, any of that stuff. We just got to take them out of influential, important positions. In such a situation, only one's course is practical. The golden rulers may establish a progressive society in which they live according to their ideals while maintaining an adequate defense against their benighted fellows who might seek either to exploit their pacific predilections or to destroy their advancing civilizations. So in other words, what they're getting at here is that as civilization progresses, we tend to have more peace-loving kind of kumbaya type stuff. Like, we don't want to be violent. We don't necessarily want to learn about like how to defend ourselves. We hear this is one of the things the cabal likes to throw in our throats all the time, right? Like, oh, we're so advanced as a society. Let's get rid of our guns, right? Well, hold on a second, bucko, because if we get rid of our guns, if we don't master all domains of reality, including self-defense, then in next generation, in 10 generations, in 100 generations, somebody who's wicked is going to come and take advantage of our nescience, we'll say, our overly optimistic view of the world. Idealism can never survive on an evolving planet if the idealists in each generation permit themselves to be exterminated by baser orders of humanity. Again, does that sound relevant right now? Do we have a situation where some evil megalomaniacal people, Klaus Schwab, Bill Gates, enter your various chosen totalitarian agent? Are they trying to kill off people? Are they trying to prevent people from exercising their free will rights, their God-given rights? Are they trying to prevent people from worshiping? Are they trying to prevent people from practicing spiritual practices? Can you think of any people trying to do that? Yeah, you're damn well right you can, because it's happening in China. It's been happening in China for a long time. And now they're bringing it here to the United States under the guise of, slowing the spread and things like this. And here's a great test of idealism. Can an advanced society maintain that military preparedness, which renders it secure from all attacks by its war-loving neighbors, without yielding to the temptation to employ this military strength in offensive operations against other peoples for purposes of selfish gain and national aggrandizement? Man, this stuff is so relevant. Like, I wasn't necessarily planning on having that, but I would argue that statement is extremely relevant. And I'm not even necessarily saying Putin is like this horrible guy. Frankly, I don't even know if I want to get into that because it's a big discussion, but I'll just say I'm very skeptical anytime the mainstream media, lockstep with every other media organization, pushes a certain narrative within hours of things happening. Let's just put it that way. National survival demands preparedness, and religious idealism alone can prevent the prostitution of preparedness into aggression. Only love, brotherhood, can prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. I couldn't agree more. What is it that prevents a woman from getting brutalized at a concert? Well, it's because the other guys, the white knights, the other people who are there are like, hey, that dude's trying to rape that girl over there. We should do something about it. One of the benefits to a well-armed society, in my opinion, this is just my personal opinion, I think every citizen of the United States should be offered an opportunity to train in weaponry and then train in militias so that we can defend our houses, ourselves, and our communities from criminals. And I mean that on a practical level. Like, interestingly enough, in a society where everybody knows how to defend themselves to a certain extent, criminal behavior drops considerably because, as it turns out, most criminals are cowards and they only want to enact criminal behavior for the most part when they know they're going to get away with it. So what happens when you take the ability to defend yourself, or when a government robs a society of its ability to defend itself, either by know-how, because you know how to use a gun, or by the gun itself, you know what happens? Then criminality explodes. That's what happens. All right, so let's get into the actual meat and potatoes here. So the evolution of competition, this is a really interesting section. Competition is essential to social progress, but competition unregulated breeds violence. In current society, competition is slowly displacing war in that it determines the individual's place in industry, as well as decreeing the survival of the industries themselves. Murder and war different murder and war differ in their status before the mores, which are basically the social do's and don'ts of a culture. Murder having been outlawed since the early days of society, while war has never yet been outlawed by mankind as a whole. So essentially, they're discussing that. Let's see, this is a big topic. The same substance that causes an individual, a criminal, to break into cars to steal things is the same substance that causes one nation to war against another nation. Because there's resources, there's things that one group wants that another group isn't willing to work with them to get. And, we have this idea in our current world that what's yours is yours, and, there's no consequence to you having what you have, or that somebody's entitled to what you have merely because, you're white, or, well, all sorts of reasons I won't get into. So the point is that it's the same substance. We have to use effective ways of establishing who has the right to what, and competition is part of that. Think about a sports competition, or one of the ways that we settled disputes in the past was trial by combat, which I think, I'm not saying I want to advocate for people killing each other, but the idea that sometimes it's not easy to come up with a solution to a problem. And it's better to have a working solution than to have no working solution, because then that breeds war. Can you think of anything that's happening right now in the world that is a product of one group's refusal to try to meet and work with the needs of their neighbors? Yeah, it's the Ukraine and Russia situation. Despite what you're hearing in the media right now, for the people who are, in my opinion, more knowledgeable about what's actually going on and acknowledge the fact that Ukraine is itself a deep state proxy thing that was set up by Soros back in 2014 with the Ukraine color revolution, they have utterly refused to try to work with their Russian neighbors. And as a matter of fact, they've imposed insane tariffs on the oil trade of that whole situation. And there's NATO encroachment. So there's all these things that are essentially the West and Ukraine and various other people refusing to try to work with the Russians to come up with a beneficial agreement that everybody can be happy with. And that led to the Russians, essentially attacking Ukraine, and by all accounts, taking out biolabs and, doing all these things. And there's all sorts of reports of Ukrainians, soldiers and the military and operatives in Ukraine hurting their own people and blaming it on Russians. Now, is that true? Is that what's happening? I don't know. I'm not there. So take everything with a grain of salt. But keep in mind that in almost every war you can imagine, including the wars in the past 20th century, what we hear in the fog of war from the media and things like this is essentially propaganda. There's a game at stake for your acceptance of the narrative that the globalists want you to accept. We'll put it that way. The ideal state undertakes to regulate social conduct only enough to take violence out of the individual competition and prevent unfairness in personal initiative. Here is a great problem in statehood. How can you guarantee peace and quiet in industry, pay the taxes to support the state power, and at the same time prevent taxation from handicapping industry and keeping the state from becoming a parasitical or tyrannical? It's a really good question. I would say we're exploring that question right now on our planet. Throughout the earlier ages of any world, competition is essential to progressive civilization. Again, what is the point of competition? Well, what happens in the Olympics? Are they doing it just because they like to run around the track a bunch of times? No, they're trying to figure out who the best player is. That's what competition is about. It's a cooperative effort to determine who the best is. And then whoever comes up with the best way of doing something, that way should be the one that becomes the order of the day. At least that's the basic substance of it. As the evolution of man progresses, cooperation becomes increasingly effective. In advanced civilizations, cooperation is more efficient than competition. Early man is stimulated by competition. Early evolution is characterized by the survival of the biologically fit, but later civilizations are the better promoted by intelligent cooperation, understanding fraternity and spiritual brotherhood. So eventually we're going to get to a point where competition is a lot more about creating a cooperative effort of competition than just people like refusing to work with each other, and now they're forced in a non-cooperative sense to compete. There's a difference between non-cooperative competition and cooperative competition. Cooperative competition is the sports team. Your son is joined, the Green Sox of the Little League. There's another team, the Blue Sox. They have an agreement between the whole organization, the league, to compete on Saturdays and Sundays. That's a cooperative competition. A non-cooperative competition is your son's Little League team goes to the field that day, but there's another team that's trying to play there. And because there's no agreement as to who can use the field or not, a riot breaks out between the parents, and there's a massive competition. See the difference? True competition in industry is exceedingly wasteful and highly ineffective, but no attempt to eliminate this economic lost motion should be countenanced if such adjustments entail even the slightest abrogation of any of the basic liberties of the individual. I see. So what they're getting at here is that, industrial competition tends to be wasteful, right? Like, instead of one industry producing the products we need, we got double the industries because each one is trying to make money. That has waste associated with it. But if we create a monopoly, like we see right now with big tech, then that comes with another problem, right? Because then the monopoly is like, well, hey, we got a monopoly. Oh, you want to post something that we don't agree with on Facebook? Sorry, bucko, you can't do it. That's an abrogation of rights of the individual. And, one thing that's really important, the way that the Urantia book defines individual liberty is essentially any freedom you could have that doesn't violate the rights of another is something you are allowed to undertake. What you don't have the freedom to do is deprive another person of their rights. So that's the kind of critical distinction that should be made here. If your neighbor has food and you're hungry, you have the right to go and ask your neighbor if he can share some food, and you have the right to negotiate a fair compensation for any food that he gives you. Maybe you're going to rake his leaves or something, or maybe you're going to, do whatever. But you don't have the right to be like, hey, I'm hungry, and therefore you have to give me your food, because that deprives your neighbor of the rights to use the resources they've been cultivating and they've been owning for their own personal benefit. The profit motive. Present-day profit motivation economics is doomed unless profit motives can be augmented by service motives. Ruthless competition based on narrow-minded self-interest is ultimately destructive of even those things which it seeks to maintain. Exclusive and self-serving profit motivation is incompatible with Christian ideals. So in other words, exclusive and self-serving profit motivation. So in other words, I'm going to accumulate as much wealth as humanly possible, even if if I have to squash my neighbor in the process. That's not in concert with Christian ideals, meaning Christ would not have done that, the true substance of what it means to be Christian. Much more incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. There you go. In economics, profit motivation is to service motivation. In economics, profit motivation is to service motivation what fear is to love in religion. But the profit motive must not be suddenly destroyed or removed. It keeps many otherwise slothful mortals hard at work. So in other words, we can't just go from a society that, we live in a society where the reason people work isn't necessarily because they want to enhance their knowledge and skill and expertise and then give that as a gift to their society by working and in return receive a fair compensation. That's not the world we live in. We live in a world that is heavily pleasure-seeking focused, right? You're going to work because you don't want to starve. You're going to work because you want to go on that vacation next week. You're going to work because you want that new iPhone or something like that. You're not necessarily going to work, especially at a shitty job, frankly, because you really like the job and you want to go hang out with your friends at the job. Now, certainly there's a mix of these kind of things, but the general narrative that guides our society is that you work because if you don't, you can't survive, right? You have to earn a living. So we can't just rip that away from a society, because ultimately, and this is the kind of the whole point of this discussion we're having, is that if we think about spiritual growth and the personal motivation of an individual to contribute to society, the less spiritual growth there is in a civilization and a culture, the less motivated an individual is to be of service at a brotherhood level, the more self-serving they end up being. So there's a transition process that we need to employ. I could talk more about that. We'll just leave it at that. It is not necessary, however, that social energy arouser be forever selfish in its objective. So in other words, we don't forever need to use pleasure, increasing opportunity to gain more pleasures through your wealth that you gain because you're working a good job as the only motivation to motivate an individual. The profit motive of economic activities is altogether base and wholly unworthy of an advanced order of society. Nevertheless, it is an indispensable factor throughout the earlier phases of civilization. Profit motivation must not be taken away from men until they have firmly possessed themselves of superior types of non-profit motives for economic striving and social serving. There are transcendent urges of superlative wisdom, intriguing brotherhood, and excellency of spiritual attainment. I won't get too deep into that because that's a whole discussion right there, but basically it's the idea that it's very difficult to want to devote yourself to a community that lets you starve. Right? Why is it that we see so much crime rampant in, lower income communities? It's because if you're a lower income community member, you're living in a community where there's not a whole lot of opportunities, your basic needs aren't being met. You're struggling, right? And because you're struggling, it's like being starving and sitting around a bunch of people who are eating a bunch of meals. Eventually the thought's going to come into your mind while you're sitting around all these people who are gorging themselves and your stomach is rumbling that, these guys don't really care about me, and they don't necessarily care about helping me meet my basic needs so I can better participate in whatever they're going to go do. So, if they just let you starve and they're like, all right, now let's go out to work and work our asses off in the field, you're kind of like, dude, I don't have the energy. You guys have been eating. I don't. And then that's where essentially it's the subtle manipulation and the cultivation of a criminal society. What is a good way to create a lot of criminal behavior in a society? You deprive some portion of the population from meeting their basic needs. And now the people who have their basic needs met become the targets of the people who don't. And this is exactly what the Soviets or the Bolsheviks did in the Soviet Revolution, and the same basic method they've used mostly throughout all those socialist revolutions. So I'm going to check the chat here. Okay, no questions as of yet. Feel free to jump in with questions if you got any, and I'm just going to keep going. Let's see here. All right, I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. I didn't realize we'd be going so late. Surprise, surprise. So education. The enduring state is founded on culture, dominated by ideals and motivated by service. The purpose of education should be to the acquirement of skill, pursuit of wisdom, realization of selfhood, and the attainment of spiritual values. In the ideal state, education continues throughout life, and philosophy sometimes becomes the chief pursuit of its citizens. So in other words, progressive education. Education doesn't just stop at 18 years old. We're constantly, we should be constantly learning things, not only because it's very fulfilling, so it's going to, your ability to play is very important psychologically, which is increasingly becoming a well-recognized thing in psychology. Turns out adults play by exploring information, and you do so even better when you can do it in a social group. So we'll just leave it at that. The citizens of such a commonwealth pursue wisdom as an enhancement of insight into the significance of human relations, the meanings of reality, the nobility of values, the goals of living, and the glories of cosmic destiny. Urantians, Earth people, should get a vision of a new and higher cultural society. Education will jump to new levels of value and passing of the purely profit-motivated systems of economics. Education has long been localistic, militaristic, ego-exalting, and success-seeking. It must eventually become worldwide, idealistic, self-realizing, and cosmic grasping. So in other words, our education systems need a big overhaul. Education recently passed from the control of the clergy to that of lawyers and businessmen. Eventually, it must be given over to the philosophers and the scientists. Teachers must be free beings, real leaders, to the end that philosophy, the search for wisdom, may become the chief educational pursuit. And I think that's essentially true because, again, you can't learn anything without philosophy, despite what you might hear about in the mainstream academic world. Education is the business of living. It must continue throughout a lifetime so that mankind may gradually experience the ascending levels of mortal wisdom, which are the knowledge of things, the realization of meanings, the appreciation of values, the nobility of work, duty, the motivation of goals, morality, the love of service, character, and cosmic insight, spiritual discernment. So that's the levels of ascending education and wisdom. And that's true at a personal level, and that's true at an individual level, you know. And when you're a kid, you don't know what the heck anything is, so you're asking your parents a million different things. Then as you begin to get a vocabulary, or you develop a conceptual lexicon, or you start to understand the objects in your environment, then you realize they have meaning. You know, that thing that mommy and daddy goes into to grab your water is called a refrigerator. And that's where the things that you want are. And then eventually you discover you might be able to get in there when you're a kid and start eating stuff maybe your parents don't want you to eat. Values, all that stuff. So this is true not only for individuals, it's true for a society. It's the same basic thing. And then by means of these achievements, many will ascend to the moral ultimate of mind attainment, God consciousness. 8, the character of statehood. The only sacred feature of any human government is the division of statehood into 3 domains of executive, legislative, and judicial functions. This is also can be applied to the way the human body works. We have an executive area, the forebrain, the neocortex, where decisions get made. Legislative, that's also where things are assessed. When you have a craving, your body's effectively serving this craving up to you and be like, hey, do you want this? It's like a waiter coming by. Hey, do you want this? Hey, do you want this? Hey, do you want this? You got to sit and decide, like, what should we do? That's executive, but it's also legislative because both two parties are arguing what should happen. And judicial, what has happened was that good or bad? So it's reflective. The universe is administered in accordance with such a plan of segregation of functions and authority. Aside from this divine concept of effective social regulation or civil government, it matters little what form of state a people may elect to have, provided the citizenry is ever progressing toward the goal of augmented self-control and increased social service. The intellectual keenness, economic wisdom, social cleverness, and moral stigma of a people are all faithfully reflected in statehood. So essentially, just like everything you do affects your personal experience in your body, whether it makes you healthy, whether it makes you happy, all these things, all of your choices, all the things you interact with, the information you expose yourself to, what it means to you, how you contend with that, all that stuff affects your thought process, your emotional state, the quality of your life, all these kind of things. Well, there is societal equivalence of that very same thing. What kind of media is pushed onto a society? What are the cultural values? How smart are the people in the social groups? What is considered moral? What is not considered moral? All those things affect the health of the state. And yeah, so I could talk a lot more about that. We'll just leave it at that for now. The evolution of state entails progress from level to level as follows. So now we're going to get through these 12 levels, and that's basically the end. The creation of a threefold government of executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So that's one of the first things, or one of the steps in this process. The freedom of social, political, and religious activities. What nation can you think of that inaugurated this idea of freedom of religion? Now, it might not have been the United States. There might have been other nations that did this, and I actually think there were. I believe the Carolingians were very tolerant of other religions, although they were definitively a Christian nation. Christian nation. 3, the abolition of all forms of slavery and human bondage. Yeah, we're not there yet. We're getting there. We're not quite there yet. The ability of the citizenry to control the levying of taxes. Well, we're kind of there. And, it's written in the Constitution that the Congress has the power to levy taxes and manage the coin. But I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I have a whole lot of control over what taxes are imposed on me. As a matter of fact, most people don't. Often these decisions, especially at a congressional level, for example, the Federal Reserve Act was not written by Congress people necessarily. It's written by a bunch of bankers who then went to Congress people to have that legislation be brought into Congress, which was then voted on, which then was agreed to and ratified and all that stuff. So it ain't the citizens that are coming up with how taxes are levied. It's the oligarchs. It's the plutocrats. The establishment of, in this current form of society, and to speak to what the paper is speaking to, eventually we actually have to have real tangible, as citizens, we should have the real tangible ability to impact and change our society given certain means and measures. It's not pure democracy where we can all agree to kill one group of people. It's got to be guided by, objective morality. The establishment, excuse me, the establishment of universal education, learning extended from the cradle to the grave, 100%. We've made a lot more progress on this one than we have in the past few hundred years, for sure, because we have this thing called the internet. You can spend the rest of your life learning about amazing things that have a profoundly beneficial impact on you, your family, your community, and your children, if you choose to do so. Or you could just play Candy Crush for the rest of your life. Oh, some loud thunder right there. I don't know if anybody heard it. The proper adjustment between local and national governments. This is something we're slowly starting to come to terms with. Unfortunately, the venue of global cooperation from nation to nation and community to community has been hijacked by globalists. And even that term globalists isn't really accurate. We should be calling them dysgenic globalists, something like that, like malevolent globalists. But there is a greater ideal of true, what we might say, freedom-based globalism, if we want to use that term. Although I think we aren't necessarily at a place yet where we can even talk about the idea of what a global society would look like, because it's got so much negative stigma associated with it. 8, due to recognition of sex equality in the coordinated functioning of men and women in the home, school, and church, with specialized service of women in industry and government. So in other words, we have the integration of all the sexes in society based on what they, one, choose to do. So we're not forcing women to go work in fields they don't want to, because we want to have this ridiculous idea that we have to have equal numbers of women and men in every role in society, which is ludicrous. It has to be based on volition, and it has to be based on quality. There are some jobs that men, just generally speaking, prefer to do and are better at doing than women. We shouldn't just try to force women into these jobs because we've got this ridiculous idea of what it means to have an inclusive society. 9, the elimination of toiling slavery by machine invention and the subsequent mastery of the machine age. This is something we're starting to do right now. We're starting to realize that we don't have to have, endless amounts of toil. Do we really want to go back to a society where we don't have indoor plumbing? I don't want to. Do we really want to go back to a society where we're all doing everything by candlelight? No. But we want to wisely use our machines, and we don't want to create a technocratic age where, this is something I've talked about. It's parasitic technology, right? The idea that, you can use this device to get from point A to point B on in using maps or Google Maps or Waze or whatever, any of these apps that help you navigate. But if that means you don't know how to navigate now unless you got this device, then that's a dependency. That's codependent technology, we might say. We want to have interdependent technology where the technology is enhancing our intelligence and our skills, not necessarily detracting them. Which, if you want to think, there's a very few fictional works that even hint at that idea, and Dune is one of them. Really fascinating. 10, the conquest of dialects, the conquest of dialects, the triumph of universal language. So we eventually want to progress to a world where there is one universal language. Now, does that mean there are no other languages? No. Will arguably be multiple languages for a long period of time. But one of the interesting things is apparently there's this divine language, and I'm not talking about Enochian either. Apparently there's a language that the government of heaven uses. And the reason that's beneficial is, oh boy, do I want to get into this? Well, let's just say that the words you use and the way you speak and think and write, or the way you write and speak, directly affects how you think. And so there's this relationship between how you express ideas and what ideas end up getting generated in your mind. So is it possible that the language itself has an objective quality? It's not just I just want to speak Chinese and English, and they're basically exactly the same. No, there are subtle differences in how that affects you as an individual, your relationship with reality, how you think, your philosophy, your values, things like this. So this idea of we should think of technology, or we should think of language like a technology, and we should be trying to enhance the quality of that technology to better serve people, just like any other kind of technology. The ending of war, international adjudication of national and racial differences by continental courts and nations presided over by supreme planetary tribunals automatically recruited from periodically recurring heads of the continental courts. The continental courts are authoritative. The world court is advisorial, moral. So in other words, this is, man, we could talk like for an hour about this one alone, but basically the idea that instead of waging wars by killing people, right? You wage a war in a courtroom. That's what the law and the justice system is supposed to serve. That's one of the functions it's supposed to serve. People are going to disagree with each other about all sorts of things for all the different kinds of reasons. Our job as an enlightening society is to create a safe place, and I mean that beneficially, a safe place where disagreements can occur without killing a whole bunch of people. That's what the statement is getting at. And it's also suggesting, this is one of the big ones, it's not that the world court overrides the local community. Remember, it's individual is the highest level of divine protection, we might say, from a legal and lawful perspective, and then it goes down from there. So at the lowest level, we have global government. So it's not the global government gets to force the individual to do whatever the hell the global government wants. The global government ends up just giving recommendations like, hey, we think this is the best things and these are the reasons why. But it's ultimately up to you, because all law and all civil society, all legal codes are actually social agreements. It's actually people getting together and agreeing what they want to have govern their lives. So it always starts with the individual. 12, the worldwide vogue of the pursuit of wisdom, the exaltation of philosophy. So in other words, we need to be pursuing, this is what doing the Father's will in heaven means. When you hear this term a lot in this book especially, and you hear it a lot in Christianity, like we have to do the Father's will. We have to follow God's will. We have to listen to his word and follow and be obedient to God, all these things. But what does that even mean? Well, in one slice of that very big question, the answer to that is to seek perfection, to seek the best ways of doing things, to master the practical sides of life. And that's part of what that's about. The evolution of world religion, which will passage the entrance of the planet upon the earlier phases of the settlement of light of life. Now, this one is way far off. In another paper, again, I believe it's paper 51 or 52, it talks about these phases of the evolution of a society. Right now, we're in about the 3 to 4 phase, although arguably we're still stuck in like 2 because we don't have a representative divine government here on earth. Normally, according to the Urantia book, that is exactly what happens. We have various spiritual and divine representatives that teach humanity, and they're not forcing humanity to do something. So it's not like force. We just get to decide what we want to do, but they're there to help guide the process. We don't have that. We're in a quarantine spiritual situation. Although we did have somebody you might have heard of, and other people you might have heard of throughout history, come here to help teach things to humanity. We call those people prophets or even messiahs. So, when you hear this, don't think, oh my God, he's talking about a one world religion, that, this is just, globalism. He's just the agent of George Soros. No. Boy, that would be easier. Maybe I'd finally be, the funding problems we've been having would be so much of an issue. I'm definitely not pushing that. This is a once we finally get to the substance of what a religion is, and it ceases to be kind of a social cult of dogma and more about an actual personal quest of individuals knowing the divine and then bringing those seeds of personal wisdom to the social group to enhance their personal pursuit, then we're starting to talk about what an actual real, planetary religion might look like. But it's never going to be a, Catholicism rammed down your throat and you have to do what the church father says or you're going to go rot in some jail somewhere. That's not what it's like. And lastly, these are the prerequisites of progressive government and the earmarks of ideal statehood. Urantia, or the earth, that's the term for the earth in these papers, is far from the realization of these exalted ideals. But the civilized races have made a beginning. Mankind is on the march toward higher evolutionary destinies. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is the spiritual discussion. I've been itching to talk to you guys about that for some time now. Let me check if there's any questions. Excellent. I'm glad you all have enjoyed this. As always, if you have any suggestions, you want me to cover some topic, I can cover conceivably almost anything, although I'm hardly an expert. I just like researching things and getting to know stuff. But I love talking about law, philosophy, psychology, and spirituality. So, and the Urantia book and Ucadia material are two of the places I found to be the most rich with respect to distilled knowledge. Ucadia and Urantia work really well together, at least at a conceptual level. They don't acknowledge each other necessarily, but they, as bodies of wisdom. There's all sorts of other bodies of wisdom too. So, but if you ever got any questions, pop them in the chat, or even better, send me an email if you want. Justin@vigilant.news, Justin@vigilant.news. That's the new Vigilant News email. So I'll check that, and always open to suggestion for other spiritual topics of discussion. I'll likely find some other interesting thing coming from the series. I might pull from the Ucadia material a little bit, which is a little more dry and technical in its descriptions, but it's amazingly rich and powerful with what it has the potential to offer. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a transition phase of the planet, I would argue. The cabal have gone into overdrive to push the Great Reset. Klaus Schwab thinks that we're going to have, a society where everybody's digitally marked but either by some means of their DNA by 2026. That's only a few short years away. So these people they're not stopping. They are going full steam ahead with their maniacal agenda. We, the people, have to work alongside or work with each other to advance the ways of freedom as they advance the ways of tyranny, because it is a spiritual competition. And as far as I can tell, and this is also something that's discussed rather abstractly in the Bible, but it is in there. It's definitely mentioned in the Urantia book, and it's mentioned also in things like the Law of One and whatnot. But it's the idea that, even in academic places, they're talking about, things like the fourth turning and stuff like this. But it's the idea that we are in a transition right now. We're at a place where we're either going to go really deep and dark into tyranny, or we're going to start to climb out of the tyranny we've been in over the past, at least 100 years. I would argue much longer. So I think this information is very important, very interesting, very enlightening. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any, if you would like to offer a tip and send a contribution to our way, we would greatly appreciate it. Check the description, stillnessinthestorm.com/donate. You can get support there. Buy us a cup of coffee, buy us a steak dinner, buy us a salad if that's your preferred way to eat. Whatever you need to do to support us, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Much love. Stay safe out there. Be very careful. Stock up on supplies. And I'll see you all next time. Take care.